Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's program, which is generously supported by the museum's Friends of Asian Art group. My name is Dani Chan, and I am the Associate Curator of Asian Art at the Walters Art Museum. Before we get started, I would like to make the following land acknowledgement. The Walters Art Museum acknowledges the Susquehannock and Piscataway nations that originally inhabited this land. The tribal groups, including the Lumbee and Cherokee that migrated here, and the indigenous peoples whose ancestors are represented in the objects we steward in our collection. To learn more, please visit the link posted in the comments. Also, please note that this program is being recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube channel and Facebook page. This year, all of the talks in this series will be especially focused on the museum's Asian and Islamic art collections to coincide with the opening of our new galleries across Asia, Arts of Asia and the Islamic World, which will open in April this year. Today's speaker, Dr. Ashley Dimmig, knows the Walters Islamic collection intimately, as she is the museum's former Wieler-Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow in Islamic Art from 2019 to 2022, and remains the guest curator for Across Asia. Ashley is currently the Crossman Gallery Director at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. There, she oversees both the Crossman Gallery and the Community Engagement Center Gallery. She also teaches art history courses in the Department of Art and Design. Ashley holds a doctorate from the University of Michigan with a dissertation titled Making Modernity and Fabric Architecture, Imperial Tents in the Late Ottoman Period. Her art historical fields of specialization include the art and architecture of the Islamic world, particularly Turkish and Persian spheres, during the early modern and modern periods. With a fine arts background in fiber arts and weaving, Ashley is especially interested in textiles across the Islamic world. She has published various articles related to her dissertation, as well as essays on approaches to Islamic art in the museum. In today's talk, Ashley will discuss some of the ways in which the new galleries in Across Asia will evoke for the visitors the sensory experience of art in the Islamic world. At the same time, she will discuss the care with which the museum must navigate to handle sensitive issues of culture and identity. If you have questions during the talk, please leave them in the comments and we'll address them during the Q&A. Now, please join me in welcoming Ashley Dimmig to our program. Welcome, Ashley.
Thanks so much, Donnie, and thank you for having me back at the Walters. It's continuously a pleasure to work with you. And thanks to all of you who are joining us here live. Tonight, I will be talking about some of the spectacular objects in the Walters collection of art from the Islamic world. And just a brief note on that phrasing, which we've heard Donnie say here as well. I'm using the phrase art of the Islamic world here and in the new galleries in the broadest possible way to include art made by Muslims, for Muslims, or in Muslim majority cultures. The objects themselves may or may not have explicitly religious functions or meanings, and indeed you will see a variety of objects along that spectrum in my presentation tonight. My talk today is in part informed by the years I spent in Istanbul, which was unequivocally a transformative experience for me, as I was all of a sudden immersed in a veritable kaleidoscope of art, architecture, and material culture. This was entirely different from the way I had previously studied art, through books and in museums. How could I not be changed by being enveloped by the blues and greens of ceramic tiles, seeing the sunlight glint off of crystal chandeliers in mosques and palaces, touching the cold, smooth surface of ancient marble columns, touched by thousands of people before me, hearing the waves of the Bosphorus crashing on the shore, and smelling anything and everything from incense and fish to spices and flowers in the gardens of the former Ottoman palace. I don't want to fall too deeply into reminiscing about Istanbul, or we will be here all night, but I bring this up to say that it was not only my academic expertise that informed my work on Across Asia, but also my real-world experiences. As such, one of my aims was to infuse the new galleries with just a small taste of that multisensory, full body experience of Islamic art and architecture, and to bring it to life and make it personal for our Baltimorean audiences. I'm not alone in my fascination with sensory histories, especially and including those of Istanbul. My former advisor at Koç University in Istanbul, Nina Ergin, has published cutting edge scholarship on the soundscape of Istanbul, as well as its olfactory landscape. Another friend and colleague, Lauren Davis, turned her doctoral research on the smells of Istanbul into an interactive exhibition at the Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations in 2015-16 called Scent in the City, which you can see a couple of my photos from here. She traced the history of the city from ancient Byzantium to Byzantine Constantinople, Ottoman Istanbul, and the Turkish Republic, even, the industrialization of the city through its smells and their effect on memory and placemaking. These scholarly and curatorial approaches to sensory histories and multisensory perception are also supported by Islamic thought. The practical conundrum for the modern museum curator, though, is how to evoke multisensory engagement with historical art objects when they are viewed through glass in a modern display case and surrounded by often neutral colors. So let's begin with the sense of sight and visual perception, which very often is considered to be the primary sense and sometimes as the most objective sense in terms of things like scientific observation, or indeed when we speak of the visual arts. In the case of this ceramic mosque lamp, it is more than a form with a surface decorated with calligraphy and floral motifs. It is also more than just a functional light source. The lamp, as such, also represents the divine light of God. This passage from the Quran on light actually appears in the form of calligraphy on other such lamps, though not this one, as well as in spaces like domes in mosques where light is flooding in from windows surrounding it, and it can be quite ethereal. And I'll read the quote here for you. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. The example of his light is like a niche within which is a lamp. The lamp is within glass. The glass as if it were a pearly white star lit from the oil of the blessed olive tree, neither of the east nor the west, whose oil would almost glow even if untouched by fire. Light upon light, Allah guides his light to whom he wills, and Allah presents examples for the people, and Allah is knowing of all things. This so-called light verse indeed demonstrates the symbolic power of a lamp as a metonym for God's omnipotence. And while this particular lamp is not glass, it certainly fits the bill with its pearly white ceramic surface. But light plays an important role in scientific treatises as well as religious texts. And of course, historically, these categories are not clear cut. The 11th century thinker Ibn Hazm describes sight as the superior sense because of its reliance on light, which, as we have seen, is divine. Quote, the superior virtue of visual perception lies in the fact that its substance is the loftiest and most sublime of all substances. For the eye possesses the property of light, and by it alone may colors be perceived. Moreover, no other organ surpasses it in range and extent, since by the eye one perceives the bodies of the stars themselves in the distant firmament and also the heavens, notwithstanding their tremendous height and distance, end quote. And as just a little spoiler, there will be a whole section on stargazing in the new Islamic galleries as well. So stay tuned for that. And if you can bear with me for just one more quote to lay the groundwork for how we might be able to see and thus understand art in the Islamic context, Ibn al-Haytham tells us that visual perception relies upon contemplation. In other words, close, slow looking with an engaged mind. Quote, sight will ascertain the form of a visible object only by scrutinizing all parts of the object and contemplating every feature that may appear in it. This being the case, sight perceives the true forms of visible objects only by contemplation. Indeed, I'm showing you here the same lamp, but from another angle, which reveals one of its most charming elements, a flower on its bottom. In previous displays of Islamic art here at the Walters, this flower was not visible, but in its original context as a lamp hung in space, the flower would indeed have been seen from viewers below. And we're aiming to replicate that to some degree in the new galleries so that people can appreciate, quote, all parts of the object and contemplate every feature, as Ibn al-Haytham implores us to do. But it also requires contemplation or internalizing what we see and engaging our imagination to fully apprehend and appreciate it. And that is exactly what I'm asking of you here tonight with this little virtual preview. And I hope you keep this in mind when you come to see these objects in person across Asia after it opens in April. Before delving further into more ways of looking and visually perceiving art from the Islamic world, I want to provide one example in the collection that will be on view in the new installation that is believed to have been made for someone with blindness or low vision. This exquisite watch, densely adorned with precious materials and Arabic numbers, made by a Greek watchmaker living in Istanbul, is fitted with tiny pearls raised from the watch's face in order to provide a tactile way to read the time. And you can see here at the 12 o'clock position, there are 2 pearls, so you could count your way around to check the time. As in this case, our senses can work together or in lieu of each other to both use and appreciate the artistry of fine objects such as this. Another intricately adorned object made from precious materials and recently treated by our stellar conservation team will be on view in the new Arts of Persian Cultures gallery. Here we have a basin inlaid with silver and gold in a variety of motifs and imagery. And zooming in here a little bit, you can see just one of these vignettes between a couple roundels that have calligraphy. Here we see a ruler seated enthroned with sort of courtiers around him and just flooded by all of this vegetation, sort of set in this garden setting. When you encounter this in the galleries this spring, please do take the time to examine these details, and so many little secrets can be found in these minute details. It's really remarkable. But it's the inside of the basin that plays with our sense of sight and visual perception. So here now we're looking down into it. But zooming in, here we see the bottom of the basin populated by many little fish in silver inlay and a few other marine creatures, including a little crab. And I'll see if you can find that for yourselves here. And that's obviously in honor of Maryland. But just let your eyes wander through the swirls of fishes to find a pattern that sometimes seems to be there and then sort of falls apart in your mind's eye. Now use your imagination to return this object to its original context and an intended function. That is, envision the basin filled with water. As the liquid moves and ripples, the silver fish, polished to a high shine, would glisten and appear animated as though swimming through a real pond. The skilled craftsmen who made this basin and others like it that feature this similar fish pond motif surely created this optical illusion on purpose to trick the eye and play with our visual perception. In the new galleries, adjacent to this remarkable water basin will be a group of objects related to the often paired activities of food and entertainment. So think Super Bowl parties, but Iranian royalty style. This silver plate with faint traces of gold was made for the Persian court, probably shortly before or right around the time Islam came to the region. The scene represents a king and queen seated on a banqueting couch, next to which is a tray piled high with what looks to be berries. And beneath them are three boar's heads, which is surely a sign of a bountiful feast. But this object is not merely representational in its imagery. Its function paralleled its depiction and was itself used to serve delicious foods at a royal banquet. With this plate and the basin before, as well as the next few objects I'll show you, we have to imagine not only how these objects would have been used in their original context, but how food and water and beverages would have obscured the viewing of their decoration, which would be revealed after the food was eaten or the liquids drunk. At the same time, we have to imagine the taste of the various foods that would have been served on these dishes, including this lusterware ceramic serving platter made with seven separate compartments for serving various confections. And I do apologize if you are currently hungry for dinner, but imagine too the tastes of garlic and lamb, fish, stewed greens, fragrant herbs, yogurt, pistachios, fruits like dates and pomegranates, as well as rosewater. These were all a part of the experience of these objects that cannot be replicated, only imagined in the context of the art museum. In order to prompt visitors to engage with Persian ceramics in particular, we're currently working on a set of interactive booklets for the new galleries that prompt such gustatory imaginings and asks visitors to think about the tactility and visual effects of surfaces and to look closely at the diverse repertoire of imagery on Persian ceramics. And while we're appreciating Persian cuisine through ceramic artifacts, imagine too liquids once imbibed from vessels such, oh, sorry, missed a slide. Here I'm also including, just to aid in your imaginings here, the social scene that these ceramics would have been used in and viewed in as a part of the feast, with often poetry and music accompanying them as well. But here we'll look at a minai or enameled cup and think about how drinking from this would have changed our perception and appreciation of the object. Whether water or wine, or in the early modern period, coffee, again, these pleasurable tastes were an integral part of the experience of the object that should not be forgotten, though their contexts have now changed. And in fact, coffee brings us back to the Ottoman Empire for a moment. And this spectacular coffee set is among the several dozen objects that will be in the Across Asia installation that have never been on view before. So this is a really exciting teaser here. And now it is truly able to sparkle in its full glory, thanks to our conservators, and especially in this case, Gregory Bailey, who worked on every nook and cranny of this. Originally cultivated in East Africa, and particularly Ethiopia, by the late 16th century, coffee was also being produced and widely exported from Yemen, then part of the Ottoman Empire, to much of West and Central Asia. As a result, around this time, coffee houses began to pop up across the Islamic world, from Istanbul, Cairo, and Aleppo in the Ottoman Empire to Isfahan in Iran by the turn of the 17th century. Coffee houses were not only a place to enjoy the novel and addictive beverage, people would also share poetry, listen to music, chat, engage in political debates, and even incite rebellions and partake in racketeering. Indeed, it was a social and full body experience to engage in coffee drinking in the early modern Islamic world. Some of these activities and more can be seen happening in this manuscript painting from the Chester Beatty Library's collection. And here I just want to walk through a few of the details because there's just so much happening in this extraordinary painting. So here in the upper right corner, we have a server spooning out, ladling out the coffee into these small ceramic cups. And these appear to have sort of a blue and white decoration, which is also going to be a feature in Across Asia as well, this concept of the blue and white ceramics. But you see everyone looking on, and this one individual in the front in particular looking so excited to get his coffee, and everyone behind him eagerly sipping away. Below them, we have a group here of men reading. We have some poetry going on, a couple men with different kinds of fans. And also take note of their turbans. They all have these flowers stuck into the turbans as well. So that, of course, is going to add to the full sensorium as they're wafting their fans, drinking their hot coffee, and have the sense of flowers emanating from their turbans. It's a real full sensorium here. And at the bottom of the page, we have here just a nice little vignette of playing backgammon with one person having taken off their floral strewed turban here. But again, everyone eagerly partaking in the beverage, and you can just get the sense of the liveliness of the scene of a coffee house in early modern Istanbul. Indeed, this painting evokes the hustle and bustle of the Ottoman coffee house, but so too does the Walters coffee set in its extravagant and dense ornament. And maybe you can compare these in your mind's eye to the vessels for brewing and drinking tea that Dani has presented in the past, and which will also be featured in Across Asia. So just imagine grasping the fine golden edge of the small porcelain cup with your thumb and forefinger and sipping from it the hot, bitter liquid that we all know and love today, but which was a novelty at the time. And you could set your little cup down in this little metal bejeweled holder as you sip with a friend, because it's a setting for two. A similarly spectacular object, and indeed one made in similar materials and in a similar style, is this nargile, or hookah, a water pipe. It is a composite object, repurposing a Chinese blue and white porcelain, which I nodded to earlier, from the 18th century into a 19th century Ottoman metal armature adorned with jewels and enamel. The parallels between the nargile and the coffee set go beyond their time, place, materials, and styles. They would have occupied the same spheres of socializing. Smoking tobacco in a water pipe such as this was enjoyed after meals and with beverages like coffee. The exhaled smoke would fill the room, especially if multiple pipes were being used at once. And if you've visited Istanbul today, you've probably seen this. One can imagine, though, the glittering surfaces of this particularly extraordinary nargile shining amid the smoky fog, thus affecting the visual perception of the object, while also permeating the nostrils and creating a distinct olfactory experience while viewing it. Another consumable that is both smelled and ingested in many areas of the Islamic world is rosewater. Rosewater was typically kept in narrow-necked bottles, such as this ceramic one, though there will be another rosewater vessel made of glass also included in the new galleries as well. Rosewater has many uses, including from skincare to cooking, or to simply adorn one's body with a beautiful scent. At feasts, hosts offered their guests rosewater as a gesture of hospitality, as well as before and after meals. Ibn Sina, an 11th century Persian polymath, notes the medicinal and therapeutic benefits of the smell of roses, both on the mind and body. Beyond its ubiquity and versatility already stated, the scent of roses also has religious connotations in Islam, as the Prophet Muhammad's perspiration was said to smell of roses. In fact, there are many scents that have cultural and religious meanings in the Islamic world that have led to the production of beautiful objects now kept in art museums. Here we have an enameled incense burner from the Ottoman Empire. The lidded vessel stands on three sinuous legs affixed to a metal tray, allowing for the transportation of the censer while keeping its burning contents at a safe distance from the person's hands who are holding it. The hinged lid opens, revealing the bowl where the incense once burned. Incense can take the form of various plant and animal products, and common ones in the Ottoman world were oud, ambergris, and musk. The pierced vegetal decoration of the domed lid, oh, and here you can see where the incense really would have burned. The domed lid allows the smoke to permeate the air around. This oil painting helps our imagination here a little bit in placing this object in its original context. Here we have an Ottoman interior populated by women at leisure. And at the center, we have an incense burner, much like the one in the Walters collection, which incidentally is yet another object that will be on view for the first time in across Asia after having been beautifully conserved. Here we can see the woman holding the tray on top of which is a three-legged censer with puffs of smoke billowing out of its pierced lid. But also the experience of the beautiful objects. Sorry, jumped a line. But this smell also permeating the space affects our viewing perception and appreciation of the artistry of the object itself. And to go a step further here with an image like this, you can imagine the incense being burned almost constantly, being absorbed by the plethora of textiles from the clothing to the carpets, to the draperies on the walls, and how this perfume is really embedding itself fully in the space around you and on your body to create, again, this sort of full body experience. Like the smoke of the nargileh and the perfume of roses, the scent of different burning incenses transformed the space in which they were used. And Nina Ergin's research in particular has shown the amount of money and labor put into keeping spaces like royal tombs full of the heady scent of incense by using burners such as this one. While these olfactions are no longer a part of the viewing experience now in the museum context, we can imagine how they once were. And if I can take a moment to share a really cool little anecdote. And here again in the tomb, we have the cenotaphs, the grave markers of the Ottoman royals covered in textiles. And so here again, we would have textiles absorbing this smoke and also perpetuating the life of that scent in that space. The Kaaba in Mecca is likewise covered in a fabric covering called a kiswa, and is also perfumed and sensed with scents related to paradise and scents that have religious connotations. And in my research a few years ago, well, I suppose a few years before the pandemic, I was in London and had the pleasure of viewing objects in the Khalili collection, and they had just received a fragment of the kiswa from that year. And walking into the room with this textile that had come from Mecca, you were just blown away with the scent and smell of the thing because it still was going to be off gassing for quite some time, but it was the smell that created that aura of sacrality of the object and the site. And so again, just bringing all these together in as much as we can in our own understanding of these objects, I think is really vital. For the next section of my talk, I want to turn to a group of objects that are from different times and places across the Islamic world, but which rely on the sense of touch to bear their fullest meaning. First, we have a rather extraordinary carnelian talisman, into which is carved the most minute calligraphy, including the 99 beautiful names of God and those of the Prophet Muhammad, as well as other texts invoking God's blessings. The density of the text here is especially remarkable because this talisman is only 2 inches wide. So again, don't miss it when you come to Across Asia. You'll have to really seek it out. Thanks to Ariel Tabritha, our photographer, for these amazing images of this object that allow us to see its different qualities. So here we have an image that allows us to see the text in its as legible as it can be on its scale. But here we get a sense of the luminous quality of the blood red stone. The size and shape of the piece, as well as the node at the top that allowed for a thread to be strung through, suggests that this talisman was meant to be worn as a pendant and perhaps around the neck so that it would lay over the wearer's heart. We will see a few other examples of this placement of powerful objects on the body and strategically positioning them over the heart so that their baraka, or blessings, are in close contact with the chest. But before moving on to those last objects, I must also note the color of the stone. Just a moment ago, I described the carnelian out of which the talisman is carved as blood red. In fact, this color seems particularly effective for a talisman to be worn over the heart. A passage in the Quran describes God's creation of man as beginning with a clot of blood, and thus the blood clot represents God's power of creation. In this, the series of verses here are recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot of congealed blood. Recite in your Lord was most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man what he did not know. So this also relates to the primacy of calligraphy in arts of the Islamic world, because we think of the blood clot that is the origin of mankind with the first dot of ink that a pen makes on the page before beginning calligraphy. So there's so many layers of connotations here. And thus all of these components in this tiny object, the inscriptions, which can be read with the eyes and uttered with the tongue, the stone felt against one's heart, and the color of blood like the primordial clot, cannot be untangled, but rather must be experienced wholly with the body and all of its sensory and spiritual faculties. A necklace from Yemen likewise calls forth the color red for spiritual protection. Here, strings of coral beads interlace with intricate silver work to form a wearable talisman. In particular, the coral beads and their red color was understood to promote good health for women, especially during childbirth. And it's easy here to imagine where those associations with the color red, the material, blood, and new life coming into the world are all at play here together. And for this reason, expectant mothers were often gifted a necklace such as this with coral beads for their first child. And this is a new acquisition among several other Yemeni silver objects from Dr. Giroux and Caroline Foster. And so these will be another set of objects that have never before been seen because they are very recent acquisitions. But to hammer home this last point about bodily experience and the sense of touch, especially over the heart, is demonstrated in this wonderful portrait of a man called Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. This painting is not in the Walters collection, alas, but there is a connotation here. So please there is a connection here with the Walters collection. So please bear with me. Diallo was born into a prominent Muslim family in West Africa in the Senegambia region right around 1701. At the age of 30, he was abducted from his home and forcibly brought to the then colony of Maryland, where he was enslaved for 2 years. By an unusual turn of events, prompted by his enslaver's discovery of his being literate in Arabic and his well-connected aristocratic status, Diallo was transferred into the British Royal African Company, an organization involved with the transatlantic slave trade. Upon arriving in London in 1733, William Hoare painted this portrait, which put a face to the millions of enslaved Africans for British audiences at the time when abolitionist movements were gaining traction there. It was Jallo himself who insisted on being depicted wearing his native garb in this stately portrait, possibly as a declaration of his perseverance and resistance to conversion while enslaved. Within a year of this portrait being painted, Jallo was able to advocate for and raise money to buy his freedom with the financial support of allies like Thomas Blewett, who would later publish Jallo's biography. In a matter of months after reclaiming his freedom, Jallo was able to return home to West Africa, the first documented formerly enslaved Muslim to do so. The portrait depicts Jallo wearing around his neck a Quran fitted into a red leather pouch, representing the sitter's faith and literacy, as he was known to be able to write the entire Quran from memory. And to this day, some people still are able to do so. The Walters is home to a similar West African Quran, kept in two halves or two volumes, each in its own leather pouch. These pouches thus not only enabled faithful Muslims like Jallo to take the word of God with them and carry it on their person, it also offered spiritual protection as it was held close to the heart. And another side note here, as we're evoking all of the senses, this manuscript is not bound as a manuscript. These are actually loose bifolios, which allow for different people to be reciting the Quran from these pages simultaneously, and thus creating, as a group, this sort of polyvocal, multisensorial, but really oral recitation cacophony almost, or symphony of voices working together. And in all of this coming together here, I wanted to sit for a moment on these few objects where we have the piece being held close to the heart, especially objects that have spiritual power or baraka. And it is, in fact, in some scholarship and in some Muslim thinkers' writings, that it is the heart that is the primary organ with which to perceive what we call art. And it is not, of course, just the heart as an organ, but the heart as sort of the seat of the soul, and also sort of the center of the body. So bringing together the body, spirit, and mind all together in order to appreciate art. And Wendy Shaw is someone who's talked a lot about this in her recent book, What is Islamic Art, if you want to learn more about that. By way of sort of a casual conclusion here, I wanted to just step back for a moment and speak a little bit more about our approaches to art objects, at least my approaches to the Islamic galleries across Asia. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's not only about evoking the original context of these objects, their intended uses, how they touched different lives and were seen and smelled and tasted over the years, but also about connecting it to Baltimore. And this also gives me an opportunity to talk about my advisory committee, which I had pulled together over the last couple of years. And if any of you are listening tonight, hello, thanks for joining. It was a really wonderful group of people brought together to talk about some of the issues with displaying Islamic art and how are the best ways to display it in general, and also here at the Walters in Baltimore. And one of the strong recommendations from this committee was to make sure that we were including Black Muslims in our interpretation. And here is one of the examples of trying to connect our historical art objects with Black Muslims, and especially Muslims in America, as Islam and Islamic art are certainly deeply steeped in the history of America as well. So this is not something that is far away and long ago necessarily. These are a part of our lived experience, and bringing this to the fore, I hope we can draw greater connections with the Baltimorean community and have a few different inroads into enjoying, appreciating, and understanding arts of the Islamic world writ large, and all the different um, communities of Muslims, whether they're our neighbors or across the world. Um, and so, in doing that, it really was about bringing to the fore these kinds of lived experiences. And so, not thinking about objects as static things in a vitrine, but thinking of them as living, breathing things that colored the life of people in the past and in our present. Um, so, I think I'm going to leave it with that. Thank you. I think we'll have time for some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley, for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. And so, yes, we'll open it up for the audience questions. And over at YouTube, Safia Cheetham asks, will the necklace Quran be displayed in the exhibition as it is in the picture beside an image of Jallo?
Yes, absolutely. So, this is one of the sort of interpretive techniques and didactic techniques we're going to use in the new galleries, is bringing in different kinds of images, excuse me, from maps to reproductions of artwork and diagrams, to really delve into the details of these things and to pull out these different threads of history. And so I thought it was really important to bring a face to those stories. And so we'll have just a reproduction image of Jallo to show how the Quran would have been worn next to our Quran on display.
Yeah, and related to that portable Quran, my question was, because they're loose leaf, are there page numbers?
Oh, that's a good
Like in
question.
case it gets, mixed up when you pass it around to different people.
Or is it not a problem that things get mixed up, because the Quran often in these contexts is memorized anyway, and the written word is just a mnemonic to start reciting. So it's a different way of thinking about like a holy book, as it were, where it's not codified. It's actually a little bit more dynamic in that context in its use.
Right. Well, Sophia also has a follow-up question. Um, will there be a place in the exhibition that talks about the distinction between languages that look visually similar to audiences that may be unfamiliar to them?
That's a great question, and this is one of those tricky spots where I start to get a little too academic in trying to explain all of the details and explain everything behind it. Um, we will, in the section where we have cases showcasing our wonderful manuscripts, which will be on rotation. So they'll be up for 3 months or 6 months, and we can see different pages from different manuscripts over the life of the installation. That means there will sometimes be Arabic manuscripts, sometimes Ottoman Turkish, sometimes Persian. And so each of those will have to draw out those different linguistic and cultural contexts, to be sure. And I think it's not only important in terms of language, but one of the real underlying goals here was to demonstrate the diversity of the Islamic world. I mean, we're talking about every continent over the last, 1400 years time. It is really not encompassed in one thing. Islam and Islamic art are not monoliths, and presenting that diversity as much as we can with the objects we have is really critical to what we're doing with the new installation.
Absolutely. I also wanted to ask about the coffee set.
Mm-hmm.
It looks, as you mentioned, there's 2 cups, so it was probably more for 2 people to use. Would such a set have been found in a coffee shop, or was it more for private use?
I think that would have been that set was probably more for private use. I think they would have had sort of those stacks of little porcelain cups in the coffee houses. To sort of do the high volume of people coming through. But that's a good point to bring up too, that coffee, I talked mostly about the public spheres of drinking coffee, but coffee was also important in the home. It was part of sort of hospitality, and in particular, women were enjoying coffee much more at home, whereas the coffee houses was largely a male gendered sphere. So the beverage was enjoyed by all, but in different contexts, and in particularly in the domestic contexts. Yeah.
Well, are you a coffee drinker or a tea drinker?
Both. But it depends on the tea. And I was really missing Turkish tea the other day. You know, when you start to think, when you start to write a talk like this, you're thinking about all these delicious things and beautiful smells, and it's all tied to memory and nostalgia. But yeah, it's about the pleasures of life, right? And if our installation and our collection artworks can sort of reveal that little bit of humanity, even if it's like a small gesture like coffee and tea, behind the art objects that are reveal the humanity behind the art objects. That's what we're really in it to do, I think.
Yeah. So Christine Shaka over at YouTube,
Ooh.
she commented, just to support what Ashley just said about the Quran being used by many. I was looking at the manuscript today and it was not originally foliated, so the pages were not originally numbered.
There you
Oh.
go. Yeah. So it could be mixed and matched and then reassembled based on memory of the text.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really fun.
Over also on YouTube, Ellen Hubler asks, can you say more about the importance of incense in Islamic culture, the places and contexts it's used?
Oh, sure. It's used in it's so ubiquitous in much the same way that rosewater is. So in domestic context, you'd have it, and it would, after a meal, you might use it to sort of perfume the space and get rid of the scent of the food. It also is used very much in religious contexts, in mosques and in tombs, places that are, you know, seem to be more sacred. And so there are different, it's both everyday and special in that way, both religious and domestic.
And especially during the early modern period, Istanbul being such an urban and cosmopolitan city, I imagine all of the perfumery can also help masks, you know, the waste smells.
Yes, and this was something that Lauren Davis's exhibition Scent in the City explored. It asked, there was an interactive component that asked modern Istanbul. It was to say, well, what do you smell where? And, you know, people said things like rotten fish or urine. And then you can have the beautiful smell of linden trees and other floral scents to cover it up. So it's, when we say the full sensorium, we mean the full sensorium.
Oh, wonderful. I think that's all the time we have for today. Ashley, I definitely want to thank you so much for this great presentation, and I'm definitely hungry now
I know.
after it.
Always a pleasure.
And I want to give a big thank you to our digital team for producing this program, and to Shandy Kelly especially for coordination. And finally, a bigger thank you to you, our audience, for sharing this experience with us. We certainly welcome you back for more programs on our social platforms. For upcoming program, please visit our website at thewalters.org. Thank you and goodbye for now.